At Christmas dinner, my only son stood up in front of everyone and said openly, "We have all agreed and you are no longer my father." I wasn't shocked. I smiled and handed him a folder. "Here is a parting gift for you." As soon as he opened it, he started shouting. But before I tell you what was in that folder that made him scream like a banshee, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the story you're about to hear will shake you to your core. And trust me, you'll want to be notified when I drop the follow-up video revealing what happened 6 months later. Also, drop a comment below telling me what you think was in that folder. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare began. My name is Theodore Ted Kowalski and I'm 58 years old. I live in a small town outside of Cleveland, Ohio, where I've spent the last 30 years building a construction business from the ground up. But this story isn't about business success. It's about the most devastating betrayal a father can experience and the sweet, calculated revenge that followed. You see, my son Drake is 28 now. For the first 25 years of his life, I thought we had an unbreakable bond. I was there for every soccer game, every school play, every heartbreak, and every triumph. When his mother, my ex-wife Sandra, left us when he was 12, I became both mother and father to that boy. I sacrificed everything, my social life, potential relationships, even opportunities to expand my business, all to make sure Drake never felt abandoned. I worked 16-hour days to pay for his college tuition at Ohio State University. When he wanted to study architecture, I was thrilled. Finally, someone to carry on the family business, I thought. I even started planning how we'd rebrand the company, Kowalski Son Construction. I had dreams of teaching him everything I knew about the industry, about building not just structures, but a legacy. But Drake had other plans, and the woman who would poison his mind against me was about to enter our lives. Her name was Vanessa Hartwell. 26 years old, blonde, beautiful, and from what she claimed was old money from the East Coast. She appeared in Drake's life during his final semester of college like a perfectly orchestrated hurricane. Within 3 months, they were engaged. Within 6 months, they were married in an elaborate ceremony that cost me $47,000. I should have seen the red flags immediately. The way Vanessa's eyes would narrow whenever Drake mentioned our weekend fishing trips. How she'd suddenly develop migraines whenever I invited them over for dinner. The subtle comments about how my blue-collar background might hold Drake back in refined social circles. But I loved my son. I wanted him to be happy. So I bit my tongue and welcomed this woman into our family, even when every instinct I had screamed that she was trouble. The first major incident happened 8 months after their wedding. Drake called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice cold and distant in a way I'd never heard before. "Dad, we need to talk," he said. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" "Vanessa and I have been discussing our future and we think it's best if you step back a little." Step back. Those words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. "What do you mean, step back?" "We're adults now, Dad. We need space to build our own life without interference." Interference. 26 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion, and he called it interference. "Drake, I don't understand. What brought this on? Did I do something wrong?" There was a pause. I could hear Vanessa's voice in the background whispering something I couldn't make out. "It's not about what you did wrong, Dad. It's about what's best for our marriage. Vanessa feels like you're too involved in our lives. I respect your marriage, son. I've never tried to. You call every day. I call twice a week to check in. You drop by unannounced. I stopped by once last month to bring you those steaks from Murphy's butcher shop, the ones you've loved since you were 10 years old. See? That's what I'm talking about. We need boundaries." Boundaries. Another perfectly placed dagger in my heart. From that day forward, my relationship with my son began to deteriorate like a building with a compromised foundation. The twice-weekly phone calls became once weekly, then bi-weekly, then monthly, then nothing at all unless I initiated contact. The invitations to family gatherings stopped coming. When I'd run into them at the grocery store or around town, Vanessa would suddenly remember an urgent errand that required Drake's immediate attention. But the real poison was being injected slowly, methodically. Vanessa had a way of twisting every memory, every shared experience Drake and I had. She'd take his stories about our camping trips and suggest they were evidence of me being controlling and not respecting his need for independence. She'd interpret my offers to help with home repairs as signs that I didn't trust his abilities as a man. The most devastating part was watching my son slowly adopt her perspective. The boy who used to call me his hero began to view me as an obstacle to his happiness. The young man who once sought my advice on everything from career decisions to relationship troubles now saw my input as unwanted meddling. 2 years into their marriage, Drake started actively avoiding me. He'd cross the street when he saw me coming. When I'd call, he'd let it go to voicemail and then send a text hours later saying he was busy. The few times we did talk, our conversations were stilted and uncomfortable, like we were strangers making small talk at a bus stop. I tried everything I could think of to bridge the growing gap between us. I sent thoughtful gifts that went unacknowledged. I wrote heartfelt letters that received no response. I even tried reaching out through mutual friends and family members, but Drake had apparently made it clear to everyone that he wanted space from his father. The isolation was unbearable. Here I was, a man who had built a successful business, who had friends and respect in the community, but I was completely cut off from the most important person in my life. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Patricia Ming, just to have someone to talk to about the pain I was experiencing. "Ted," she said during one of our sessions, "you can't force a relationship with your son. Sometimes the best thing we can do is love someone enough to let them go, even when it breaks our hearts." "But he's been manipulated," I insisted. "This isn't really Drake talking. This is all her influence." "Maybe so," Dr. Ming replied gently. "But Drake is an adult. He's making his own choices, even if they're influenced by his wife. The question is, what are you going to do with this situation?" What was I going to do? At that point, I honestly didn't know. I was drowning in grief, anger, and confusion. I felt like I was mourning someone who was still alive, and in many ways that's exactly what I was doing. But then something happened that would change everything. It was a rainy Thursday evening in October, about 3 years after Drake's marriage. I was working late at the office, going over blueprints for a new commercial project when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Ted Kowalski speaking." "Mr. Kowalski, this is Detective Ray Castellanos with the Cleveland Police Department. I'm calling about your son, Drake." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Is he okay? Has something happened?" "He's fine, sir, but I need to ask you some questions about his wife, Vanessa Hartwell Kowalski." "What about her?"
"Sir, are you aware that your daughter-in-law is currently under investigation for fraud?"
The room started spinning. I sat down heavily in my chair, trying to process what I'd just heard. "Fraud? What kind of fraud?" "Multiple kinds, sir. Identity theft, embezzlement, insurance fraud. The list is pretty extensive. We've been building a case against her for the past 8 months." Detective Castellanos went on to explain that Vanessa Hartwell wasn't who she claimed to be. Her real name was Veronica Hayes, and she had a criminal history spanning 3 states. The old money family background was completely fabricated. She had no trust fund, no inherited wealth, no prestigious family connections. What she did have was a pattern of targeting successful men, marrying them, isolating them from their families and friends, and then systematically draining their financial resources before disappearing to start the same con somewhere else. "The thing is, Mr. Kowalski," Detective Castellanos continued, "your son appears to be completely unaware of her true identity and criminal activities. In fact, based on our surveillance and investigation, it seems like he's as much a victim here as anyone else." "Surveillance?" "We've been watching Mrs. Kowalski, for several months now. We know she's been having an affair with a man named Carl Brennan, who appears to be her partner in these cons. We have evidence that she's been slowly liquidating your son's assets and transferring the money to offshore accounts. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My son, the boy I'd raised to be honest and trusting, was being systematically destroyed by a professional criminal, and because of the wedge she'd driven between us, he had no idea what was happening to him. Detective, what can I do to help? Well, sir, that's partly why I'm calling. We're planning to make arrests soon, but we need to be strategic about how we handle this. Your son is going to need support when this all comes out. He's going to be devastated, financially ruined, and probably pretty embarrassed about being conned so thoroughly. Of course, whatever he needs. There's something else, Mr. Kowalski. Something you should know before we proceed. What? We have recordings of conversations between Mrs. Hayes and her accomplice. In these recordings, she talks extensively about her strategy for isolating your son from you. She specifically describes you as the biggest threat to her operation because of your close relationship with Drake and your, let's say, your protective instincts regarding your son. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This woman hadn't just stolen my son's money or cheated on him. She had deliberately and systematically destroyed our relationship as part of her criminal scheme. She did this on purpose, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, sir. Very much on purpose. She identified you as someone who might be able to see through her act, so she made it her priority to turn your son against you. And based on what we've observed, she was quite successful. Detective Castellanos and I talked for another 20 minutes about the investigation and what would happen next. The arrests would be made within the next 2 weeks. Drake would likely lose most of his savings. His house would probably be foreclosed on, and his entire world would be turned upside down. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my office for hours, staring out at the rain and processing everything I'd learned. My son wasn't the ungrateful, manipulated young man I'd thought he'd become. He was a victim, and the woman who had victimized him had used me, his love for me and trust in me, as a weapon against him. But here's the thing about being a father. Even when your child hurts you, even when they reject you and cut you out of their life, you never stop loving them. And you never stop wanting to protect them. I spent the next 2 weeks planning. Not planning revenge. At least not the kind you might expect. I was planning something much more strategic, much more meaningful. I was planning to save my son and deliver justice in a way that would teach everyone involved a lesson they'd never forget. The arrests happened on a Wednesday morning. Vanessa and her partner Carl were taken into custody simultaneously. She at a hotel where they'd been meeting, he at his apartment across town. According to Detective Castellanos, who called me with updates, Vanessa had tried to throw Carl under the bus immediately, claiming she was as much a victim as Drake was. Carl, for his part, had a briefcase full of evidence documenting all of their cons, including detailed notes about their strategy for isolating Drake from his family. Drake called me that same evening. It was the first time I'd heard from him in over 6 months. Dad? His voice was broken, hollow. I'm here, son. Did you know about Vanessa? I found out 2 weeks ago. The police called me. 2 weeks ago? There was a pause. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? Another pause. Longer this time. Probably not. Drake, I need you to know something. I never stopped loving you. Not for 1 second. Even when you cut me out of your life. Even when you told me I wasn't welcome anymore. I never stopped being your father. I could hear him crying on the other end of the line. Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. She made me believe that you were trying to control my life. She said you were jealous of our happiness and that you were trying to sabotage our marriage. I know, son, I know exactly what she did. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have chosen her over you? You weren't stupid, Drake. You were in love, and you trusted someone who didn't deserve that trust. That's not stupidity. That's having a good heart. We talked for 3 hours that night. Drake told me about the subtle ways Vanessa had manipulated his perception of our relationship. She'd take innocent comments I'd made and twist them into evidence of my supposed controlling nature. She'd manufacture conflicts and then position herself as the only person who truly understood and supported him. The worst part, Drake said, is that I remember feeling uncomfortable about some of the things she said about you. Deep down, I knew something wasn't right. But she was so convincing, and I wanted to be a good husband. You were trying to do the right thing, I assured him. You were trying to put your marriage first. I can't fault you for that. But even as I comforted my son, I was planning something that would ensure Veronica Hayes, would never be able to do this to another family. You see, during my conversations with Detective Castellanos, I'd learned some very interesting information about the case against Vanessa. While the evidence was overwhelming, there were some complications that might allow her to get off with a lighter sentence than she deserved. Her defense attorney was already working on a plea deal that would have her out of prison in 3 to 5 years. That wasn't justice. Not for my son, not for the other families she'd destroyed, and certainly not for the next family she'd inevitably target when she got out. So I made some calls. I had connections in the construction industry, which meant I had connections with insurance companies, banks, and other businesses that Vanessa had defrauded over the years. I started reaching out to her other victims, the families from previous cons that the police investigation had uncovered. What I discovered was heartbreaking. There was Janet Morrison in Phoenix, whose husband had committed suicide after losing everything to one of Vanessa's cons. There was elderly Frank Pedersen in Florida, who'd lost his life savings and had to move in with his daughter. There was the Yamamoto family in California, who'd lost their restaurant and their home. But here's what the victims all had in common. They'd been too embarrassed, too devastated, or too isolated to properly pursue justice. Many of them had never even reported the crimes to police because Vanessa had been so skilled at making them feel complicit in their own victimization. I started making connections. I hired a private investigator to help coordinate with the victims and gather additional evidence. I retained a victims' rights attorney to ensure that everyone who'd been hurt by Vanessa had a voice in the legal proceedings. More importantly, I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every piece of evidence, every detail of how Vanessa's cons worked and the devastating impact they had on families. I was building something bigger than just a criminal case. I was building a comprehensive record that would follow her for the rest of her life. But that's not all I was planning. 3 months after Vanessa's arrest, Drake's divorce was finalized. He'd lost his house, most of his savings, and his trust in romantic relationships, but he was free. We'd been rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully. I didn't push too hard or too fast. I'd learned my lesson about giving him space to make his own choices. One evening in late November, Drake came over for dinner. It was just the two of us eating takeout pizza and watching a football game, like we used to do when he was in high school. "Dad," he said during halftime, "I need to ask you something. Anything. Why aren't you angry with me? I chose her over you. I cut you out of my life completely. I said terrible things to you. Why are you being so forgiving?" I thought about his question for a long moment before answering. "Drake, I've had a lot of time to think about this situation, and I've realized that being angry with you would be like being angry with someone for bleeding after they've been stabbed. You were victimized. You were manipulated by a professional who had years of experience destroying families. Getting angry with you for falling for her con would be like getting angry with a drowning person for splashing around in the water. But I hurt you. I know I hurt you. Yes, you did. But you weren't trying to hurt me. You were trying to be a good husband to someone who was using your love as a weapon against both of us. The person I'm angry with is the person who manipulated you into hurting me." Drake was quiet for a few minutes, processing what I'd said. "What's going to happen to her?" "She's going to prison. The question is, for how long?" "And then what? When she gets out, she'll just do this to another family, won't she?" I smiled. "That's where it gets interesting, son. You see, I've been working on a little project for the past few months." I got up and retrieved a thick folder from my home office. It was labeled the Vanessa Hayes Documentation Project. "What's that?" Drake asked. "This is a comprehensive record of every crime Vanessa has committed, every family she's destroyed, and every technique she uses to manipulate her victims. It includes victim statements, financial records, psychological profiles, surveillance photos, recorded conversations, and detailed timelines of her various cons. Drake flipped through the folder, his eyes widening as he saw the scope of the documentation. "Dad, this is incredibly thorough. It gets better. I've created copies of this entire file and distributed them to law enforcement agencies in 12 states. I've also shared copies with domestic violence organizations, fraud prevention groups, and victims' rights advocates across the country. Why? Because when Vanessa gets out of prison, she's going to find it very difficult to start a new con. Every time she tries to create a new identity, every time she targets a new victim, this information will be there waiting for her. She won't be able to disappear and reinvent herself anymore." Drake stared at me with something that looked like awe. "But that's not all," I continued. "Remember how she isolated you from me as part of her strategy? How she turned your love for me into a weapon against our relationship?" "Yeah. Well, I've documented that technique extensively. I've shared her methods with family counselors, law enforcement agencies, and support groups. Her specific strategies for isolating victims from their support systems are now being taught as case studies in fraud prevention courses." "So she can't do that to other families?" "Exactly. Vanessa Hayes is about to become the most well-documented con artist in the country. Her face, her methods, her patterns, they're all going to be in databases and training materials that law enforcement and victims advocates will use to protect future targets." Drake was quiet for a long time, absorbing the implications of what I'd done. "Dad, this is brilliant, but it must have cost you a fortune. The private investigator, the lawyer, all the documentation." I shrugged. "I had some money saved up for your wedding that never got used. Seemed like a good investment." That's when Drake started crying again. But these weren't tears of sadness or shame. They were tears of gratitude and amazement. "I can't believe you did all this. After everything I put you through, you still protected me. That's what fathers do, son. We protect our children, even when they don't want our protection." But even as we sat there reconnecting, I wasn't done with my plans for Vanessa Hayes. You see, there was still the matter of the ultimate humiliation she'd planned for Christmas Day. Detective Castellanos had played me recordings of conversations between Vanessa and Carl, where they discussed their plan to have Drake formally disown me during a family gathering. It was going to be the final step in isolating him completely, and they thought it would be hilarious to do it on Christmas. Well, Christmas was still coming, and I had my own surprise planned. The trial was scheduled for January, but Vanessa made bail in early December. Her lawyer had convinced the judge that she wasn't a flight risk, despite her history of disappearing between cons. Within days of her release, she was back to her old tricks, trying to manipulate Drake into reconciling with her. She called him constantly, sent flowers to his new apartment, even showed up at his workplace claiming she needed to talk to him about important financial matters. Each time, Drake firmly but politely declined to see her, but I could see the stress was wearing on him. "She won't give up," he told me during one of our weekly dinners. "She keeps saying she was framed, that Carl forced her to do everything, that she never wanted to hurt me." Do you believe her? No? But it's still hard to hear. Part of me remembers loving her, you know? I know. That's what makes her so dangerous. 2 weeks before Christmas, Vanessa tried a different approach. She reached out to some of Drake's friends and extended family members, claiming she wanted to organize a surprise Christmas dinner to help Drake and me reconcile. She painted herself as the repentant wife who just wanted to bring our family back together. Several people fell for it, including Drake's Aunt Linda and his cousin Jessica. They called Drake and encouraged him to attend this healing dinner that Vanessa was organizing. "Dad, what should I do?" Drake asked me. Part of me thinks I should just ignore it, but Aunt Linda seems to think Vanessa is genuinely trying to make amends. What does your gut tell you? That it's some kind of manipulation. But I can't figure out what she's trying to accomplish. I could have told him, I could have shared the recordings I had of Vanessa and Carl planning this exact scenario months earlier. But I had a better idea. You know what, son? I think you should go to this dinner. Drake looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Dad, are you serious? Completely serious. In fact, I think we should both go. Why? I smiled. Because I have a Christmas present for Vanessa, and Christmas dinner seems like the perfect time to give it to her. The dinner was scheduled for December 23rd at a restaurant called the Holiday Inn. Ironic, considering what Vanessa had planned. According to the invitations she'd sent out, it was going to be a small gathering. Drake, me, Aunt Linda, Cousin Jessica, and a few of Drake's friends who'd been sympathetic to Vanessa's supposed redemption story. What Vanessa didn't know was that I'd been in contact with Detective Castellanos about her attempts to manipulate the situation. What she also didn't know was that several of the people she thought she'd manipulated into attending were actually working with me. You see, Aunt Linda wasn't as gullible as Vanessa thought. When Vanessa had approached her about organizing this dinner, Linda had called me immediately to ask if it was legitimate. I'd filled her in on what was really happening, and she'd agreed to play along to help expose Vanessa's true intentions. The same thing had happened with Jessica and two of Drake's friends. Once they understood the real situation, they were more than happy to help turn the tables on Vanessa. But the real surprise was something Vanessa couldn't have anticipated. Remember Janet Morrison, the woman from Phoenix whose husband had committed suicide after one of Vanessa's cons? Well, Janet had flown to Ohio specifically for this dinner. So had Frank Pedersen from Florida and the Yamamoto family from California. The plan was simple: let Vanessa play out her manipulation scheme, and then confront her with the full scope of the damage she'd caused to families across the country. But more than that, we were going to give her a taste of her own medicine. The evening of December 23rd arrived, and I'll admit I was nervous. Not about confronting Vanessa. I'd been looking forward to that for months. I was nervous about how Drake would handle seeing her again, especially in a setting where she'd have the opportunity to try her manipulation tactics on him one more time. Drake and I arrived at the restaurant together. The Holiday Inn had reserved a private dining room for our group, complete with Christmas decorations and a cozy fireplace. It would have been a lovely setting for a genuine family reconciliation. Vanessa was already there when we arrived, and I have to admit, she looked good. She'd clearly spent time and money preparing for this evening. Professional hair and makeup, an expensive dress, jewelry that probably belonged to one of her other victims. She greeted Drake with tears in her eyes and what appeared to be genuine remorse. Drake, honey, I'm so glad you came. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm hoping we can at least talk about finding a way forward. Drake was polite but distant. Hello, Vanessa. I'm here because Linda asked me to come, not because I want to reconcile. I understand. I just hope that by the end of the evening, you'll see that I'm not the monster everyone thinks I am. She turned to me with what she probably thought was a humble, apologetic expression. Ted, I owe you an apology too. I know I came between you and Drake, and I'm sorry for that. I was jealous of your relationship with him, and I handled that jealousy very poorly. Apology accepted, I said simply. The other guests began arriving: Linda, Jessica, and Drake's friends Tom and Monica. Everyone was playing their parts perfectly, greeting Vanessa with cautious but seemingly genuine warmth. We ordered drinks and appetizers, and for the first hour, the conversation was surprisingly normal. Vanessa was on her best behavior, asking thoughtful questions about everyone's lives, sharing what seemed like genuine regrets about her behavior, and generally presenting herself as a woman who'd made mistakes but was committed to making amends. I could see Drake beginning to relax slightly. Not because he was falling for her act, he was too smart for that now, but because the evening wasn't turning into the dramatic confrontation he'd been expecting. But then Vanessa made her move. We'd just finished our main courses when she stood up and called for everyone's attention. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, she began, her voice trembling with what appeared to be emotion. I know I've made terrible mistakes, and I know I've hurt people I care about. But being here with all of you, seeing the love and support you have for Drake, it's made me realize something important. She turned to look directly at Drake. Honey, I've been thinking about what's best for your future, and I've realized that the most loving thing I can do is step aside and let you rebuild your relationship with your father without any interference from me." This was it. This was the moment from the recordings, where she was going to manipulate Drake into publicly rejecting me as part of their twisted plan. "In fact," Vanessa continued, "I think there are some things that need to be said, some truths that need to come out so that everyone can move forward with a clear conscience." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder, clearly meant to mirror the moment from the recordings where she and Carl had planned for Drake to present me with some kind of document severing our father-son relationship. "Drake," she said, her voice getting stronger, "I think it's time everyone knew the truth about your father." Here we go, I thought. The truth about how he's tried to control and manipulate your life. The truth about how he's never respected your independence or your choices. The truth about how he's used guilt and emotional blackmail to keep you under his thumb. Drake's face had gone pale. I could see him struggling with old doubts that Vanessa's words were triggering, even though he now knew better. "I have documentation here," Vanessa continued, holding up her folder, "of phone calls your father made to private investigators to spy on us during our marriage. Evidence of how he tried to sabotage our relationship from the very beginning. This was completely fabricated, of course, but it was psychologically clever. She was mixing lies with just enough truth to make her story plausible. I had hired a private investigator, but only after her arrest, and only to help document her crimes for the other victims. The most loving thing you can do, Drake, is to finally free yourself from his toxic influence. Tell him that you no longer consider him your father. Tell him that you're done being manipulated and controlled." The room had gone completely silent. Everyone was staring at Drake, waiting to see how he'd respond. And that's when I stood up. "You know what, Vanessa? You're absolutely right. It is time for the truth to come out." I reached into my jacket and pulled out my own folder, much thicker than hers. But not the truth you're expecting. I looked around the room at all the faces staring back at us. Some shocked, some satisfied, all riveted by what they'd just witnessed. "The difference between what we did tonight and what you've been doing for years," I continued, "is that our deception was designed to protect people and expose the truth. Your deceptions have been designed to destroy lives and hide your crimes." Detective Castellanos stepped forward at this point. "Ms. Hayes, I need to inform you that based on what we've witnessed here tonight, specifically your attempt to manipulate Mr. Drake Kowalski into making false statements about his father, you're in violation of the terms of your bail. You were specifically ordered to have no contact with any potential witnesses in your case." "This is insane," Vanessa screamed, finally dropping all pretense of remorse or humility. "You people have no idea what you're dealing with. Ted Kowalski is a controlling, manipulative man who can't stand the fact that his son chose someone over him." "Actually," Drake said quietly, speaking for the first time since the revelations had begun, "I think I have a pretty good idea of what I'm dealing with now." He stood up and looked directly at Vanessa. "For 3 years you convinced me that my father was the problem in my life. You made me believe that his love for me was actually controlling behavior. You twisted every memory I had of our relationship and made me see manipulation where there was only care and concern." His voice was getting stronger as he spoke. "You took a man who sacrificed everything for me, who worked 16-hour days to pay for my education, who gave up his own social life to be both mother and father to me after my mom left, who never missed a single important moment in my life. And you made me see him as the enemy." Drake's voice cracked with emotion. "And you know what the worst part is? Even after I rejected him, even after I cut him out of my life completely, he still protected me. While I was treating him like garbage, he was building a case to make sure you could never do to another family what you did to us." He gestured toward the folder of evidence I'd compiled. "This represents months of work, thousands of dollars, and countless hours of investigation. He did all of this while I wasn't even speaking to him. He did it because that's what real love looks like. It protects people even when they don't want protection." Drake turned to face me, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, I don't know how to apologize for what I've put you through. I don't know how to make up for 3 years of treating you like you were the problem in my life when you were actually the solution. You don't need to apologize, son, I said softly. You were a victim. You were manipulated by someone whose job it was to manipulate people. The only person who needs to apologize is sitting right there. I pointed at Vanessa, who had collapsed back into her chair and was staring at all of us with undisguised hatred. And something tells me we'll be waiting a long time for that apology. Detective Castellanos approached Vanessa with handcuffs. Veronica Hayes, you're under arrest for violation of bail conditions and witness intimidation. You have the right to remain silent. As he read her rights, Vanessa looked up at me with venom in her eyes. You think you've won, she said. But this isn't over. I'll find a way to make you pay for this. Actually, I said calmly, it is over, and I'll tell you why. I sat down across from her, speaking quietly so only she could hear. For the rest of your life, every time you try to start over somewhere new, this story will follow you. Every time you try to create a new identity, someone will recognize you from the databases I've created. Every time you think you found a new victim, they'll get a phone call from someone like Janet or Frank or the Yamamoto family, warning them about who you really are. I leaned closer. You made one crucial mistake in your strategy, Vanessa. You assumed that destroying my relationship with my son would break me, but what it actually did was give me a mission. You turned me into someone who understood exactly how your manipulation works and exactly how much damage it can cause. I sat back and smiled. I'm not just a victim anymore. I'm your worst nightmare. A victim with resources, connections, and a very personal understanding of your methods. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never get the chance to destroy another family. The look of realization that crossed Vanessa's face in that moment was something I'll never forget. She finally understood that she hadn't just failed in her current con. She had created the very person who would ensure she could never successfully con anyone ever again. As Detective Castellanos led her away in handcuffs, she turned back one more time. This was supposed to be my Christmas present to myself, she said bitterly. Watching you lose your son forever. Well, I replied, I guess we both got surprised tonight. After Vanessa was gone, the room slowly began to return to normal. The other victims spent some time talking with Drake, sharing their stories and helping him understand that he wasn't alone in having been fooled by her sophisticated manipulation tactics. Janet Morrison put her hand on Drake's shoulder. Honey, she said, I want you to know that what happened to you could have happened to anyone. My husband was a successful businessman, a smart man who'd never been taken advantage of in his life, but she was just that good at what she did. Frank Pedersen nodded in agreement. The shame and embarrassment are the worst parts, he said. You keep thinking, how could I have been so stupid? But you weren't stupid. You were targeted by someone who made it her life's work to study how to manipulate people. Mrs. Yamamoto, speaking through her daughter who was translating, said that seeing Vanessa finally held accountable had given her family a sense of closure they'd never expected to find. She says, the daughter translated, that your father is a very wise man to turn his pain into protection for others. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, Drake and I found ourselves alone in the dining room. Dad, he said, I need to ask you something. When you were planning all of this, the investigation, the documentation, bringing all the victims together, did you do it for revenge? Or did you do it for justice? I thought about his question carefully before answering. Honestly, it started as revenge. I was so angry about what she'd done to us, so hurt by the way she'd poisoned our relationship, that I wanted to make sure she paid for it. I paused, collecting my thoughts. But somewhere along the way it became something bigger. When I started talking to her other victims, when I heard their stories and saw the pattern of destruction she'd left behind, it stopped being about revenge and started being about prevention. What do you mean? I mean that the best revenge against someone like Vanessa isn't just punishing her for what she's already done. It's making sure she can't do it again. Every future victim we prevent, every family we save from going through what we went through, that's worth more than any personal satisfaction I might get from seeing her punished. Drake was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd said. So in a way, she created her own worst enemy. Exactly. She took a father's love for his son and tried to weaponize it against both of us. But what she didn't realize is that a father's love is the most powerful force in the world when it's properly motivated. She gave me the motivation to make sure no other father would have to go through what I went through, and no other son would have to go through what I went through. That's right. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the snow fall outside the restaurant windows. "Dad," Drake said finally, "I know I have a lot of work to do to rebuild your trust in me." "Drake, you never lost my trust. My trust in you was never the problem. But I chose her over you. I believed her lies instead of trusting what I knew about your character." I turned to look at my son, really look at him, for the first time in years without the pain of our separation clouding my vision. "Son, do you remember when you were 8 years old and you broke Mrs. Henderson's window with a baseball?" "Yeah." "Do you remember what you did?" "I ran home and hid in my room and told you I didn't know anything about it." "And do you remember what I did?" Drake smiled slightly. "You sat on my bed and told me that everyone makes mistakes, but the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. It's how they handle those mistakes once they realize they've made them." "And then what happened?" "You walked me over to Mrs. Henderson's house and I apologized and offered to work off the cost of the window by doing yard work for her." "And did that make you a bad person? The fact that your first instinct was to lie and hide?" "No. It made me a scared 8-year-old who did what scared 8-year-olds do." "Exactly. And this situation is no different. You were manipulated by a professional, and your first instinct was to trust the person you'd made vows to. That doesn't make you a bad son. It makes you a human being who was put in an impossible situation." I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder. "The measure of your character isn't that you were fooled by her lies. The measure of your character is how you've handled yourself since you learned the truth. And from where I'm sitting, you've handled it with grace, humility, and courage." "I don't feel courageous." "Courage isn't the absence of fear, son. It's doing the right thing despite the fear, and admitting that you were wrong, apologizing for the pain you caused, and working to rebuild our relationship. That takes real courage." The drive home that night was quiet but comfortable. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had my son back. Not the idealized version I'd been missing, but the real Drake. Older, scarred by his experiences, but fundamentally the same good-hearted person I'd raised. But the story doesn't end there, because the consequences of that Christmas dinner continued to unfold in ways that none of us could have anticipated. 3 days later, on Christmas Eve, I got a phone call from Detective Castellanos. "Ted, you're not going to believe this, but we just arrested 3 more people." "What do you mean?" "It turns out that Vanessa's operation was bigger than we thought. She had a whole network of people working with her. Not just Carl, but a couple who specialized in identity fraud, and a guy who handled the financial transfers. When we arrested Vanessa the other night, she tried to make a deal by giving up the rest of her network." "That's good news, right?" "It gets better. Based on the information she provided, we were able to track down victim families in 7 more states. The total amount of money stolen is over $2 million. $2 million? And here's the thing. Because of the documentation you compiled and the victim network you helped organize, the prosecution is confident they can get full restitution for everyone. Normally, in cases like this, victims are lucky to get 10 cents on the dollar. But your work made it possible to freeze assets and track financial transfers that would have been lost forever." I was stunned. What had started as a father's desperate attempt to protect his son had turned into something that would help dozens of families recover from financial devastation. "There's something else," Detective Castellanos continued. "The FBI wants to meet with you." "The FBI?" They're interested in using your documentation methods and victim coordination strategies as a model for other fraud cases. Apparently, what you did, bringing victims together, creating comprehensive documentation, using social media and databases to track repeat offenders. It's exactly the kind of approach they've been trying to implement on a national level. I'm not sure I understand. They want to hire you as a consultant, help them develop protocols for fraud victim advocacy, and create training materials for law enforcement agencies across the country. I was speechless. In trying to save my own family, I'd apparently stumbled onto something much bigger. Ted, you still there? Yeah, I'm here. I need to process this. Think about it. But don't think too long. They want to meet with you next week. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen staring out at the Christmas lights on my neighbor's house, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Drake came over later that evening for Christmas Eve dinner, just the two of us like old times. I told him about the call from Detective Castellanos. Dad, that's incredible. You're going to be able to help so many people. I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that. Are you kidding? You're the most qualified person in the country. You've lived through it. You understand how the manipulation works, and you've proven that victims can fight back effectively when they work together. I suppose you're right. Plus, Drake added with a smile, it means Vanessa will have accomplished something good with her life even if she didn't mean to. How so? She created the person who's going to revolutionize how fraud victims are helped and how repeat offenders are tracked. In trying to destroy us, she ended up creating something that will protect thousands of families. I hadn't thought of it that way, but Drake was absolutely right. The irony was perfect. Vanessa's attempt to manipulate and isolate me had backfired so completely that she'd actually created the very thing that would ensure her methods could never be used successfully again. Christmas Day was quiet, but perfect. Drake and I went to church together in the morning, something we hadn't done since he was a teenager. In the afternoon, we worked on a construction project together, building a deck for my back porch that I'd been putting off for months. It felt good to work side by side with my son again, to teach him techniques he'd forgotten, and to see his pride when we completed each section of the project. Dad, he said as we were cleaning up our tools, I've been thinking about something. What's that? I want to change my last name back to Kowalski. I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. You changed it? When I married Vanessa, I hyphenated it to Kowalski Hayes. I thought it was a romantic gesture. But now, I don't want any part of her name associated with mine. Son, you don't need to do that for me. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. The name Kowalski represents something. Integrity, hard work, loyalty, protection of family. Those are the values I want to carry forward in my life. And the name Hayes represents everything I never want to become. We finished cleaning up in comfortable silence, and as the sun was setting, Drake asked me the question I'd been hoping he'd ask. Dad, do you think there's still a place for me in the family business? I smiled and put my arm around his shoulders. Son, there's always been a place for you in the family business. I've just been waiting for you to come home. I don't know if I remember everything you taught me. That's okay. We've got plenty of time to catch up. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I thought about the folder I'd given Vanessa at that Christmas dinner, the folder that had contained all the evidence of her crimes and the documentation of her victims. But I also thought about another folder, one that I'd been keeping in my home office for the past 3 years. This folder contained something very different. Copies of every email I'd started to send to Drake but never sent, drafts of every letter I'd written but never mailed, photos from every birthday and holiday he'd missed, and detailed notes about all the things I wanted to tell him when he was ready to hear them. I'd kept that folder as a way of staying connected to my son even when he wouldn't speak to me. It was my way of continuing to be his father even when he didn't want me to be. Now that folder seemed less important. I didn't need to save up things to tell him anymore. I could just tell him directly whenever I wanted to, because he was back in my life. But I decided to keep the folder anyway, not as a monument to our separation, but as a reminder of the power of a father's love, to survive even the most devastating circumstances. 6 months later, I was in Washington, D.C., presenting my fraud victim advocacy protocols to a room full of FBI agents, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials from across the country. Drake was there with me, not just as moral support, but as my business partner in our new venture, Kowalski Son Victim Advocacy Services. We discovered that there was a real need for private investigators and advocates who specialized in helping fraud victims navigate the complex process of recovery and legal action. Our construction business was still running, but we'd expanded into something we never could have imagined. As I stood at the podium looking out at all those faces, I thought about Vanessa Hayes, who was now serving a 12-year federal prison sentence for her crimes. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, 3 years ago my family was targeted by a professional con artist. She didn't just steal money from us. She stole something much more valuable. She stole the relationship between a father and his son. I clicked to the next slide in my presentation. But what she didn't understand is that the love between a parent and child is not something that can be destroyed by manipulation or lies. It can be hidden, it can be suppressed, it can be twisted into something unrecognizable, but it can never actually be eliminated. I looked out at the audience and saw nods of understanding. The work we do as victim advocates isn't just about recovering money or getting justice in the legal system. It's about helping families recover from the psychological damage that fraud causes. It's about rebuilding trust, restoring relationships, and creating systems that prevent these crimes from happening in the first place. I clicked to a slide showing statistics about fraud recovery rates. When victims work in isolation, they recover an average of 12% of their stolen assets. When they work together, using the coordination methods we've developed, they recover an average of 73%. Another click, another slide. But more importantly, when families approach fraud recovery as a team, rather than allowing it to divide them, they emerge from the experience stronger and more united than they were before the crime occurred. I paused and looked directly at Drake, who was sitting in the front row. My son and I are living proof of that principle. The presentation went well, and afterward, several agencies expressed interest in implementing our protocols in their jurisdictions. But the moment that meant the most to me came during the lunch break, when a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Kowalski," she said, "my name is Rebecca Thompson. My daughter was conned by someone very similar to the woman who targeted your family. The con artist convinced her that I was trying to control her life, and that she needed to cut me out completely in order to have a healthy relationship with him. I'm sorry to hear that. How long has it been since you've spoken to your daughter?" 2 years. But after hearing your presentation, I think I understand now what I need to do. I need to focus on protecting her rather than trying to convince her that I'm right. She handed me a piece of paper with her contact information. "Would you be willing to help me? I can pay your fees. I just want my daughter back." I looked at the paper, then at Drake, who nodded encouragingly. "Rebecca," I said, "you don't need to pay any fees. What you need is to understand that getting your daughter back isn't about winning an argument or proving that you're right. It's about loving her enough to do whatever it takes to keep her safe, even when she doesn't want your protection." We talked for another hour, and by the end of our conversation, Rebecca had a plan for how to approach her daughter's situation. More importantly, she had hope for the first time in 2 years. That evening, as Drake and I flew back to Cleveland, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Dad, do you ever wonder what would have happened if Vanessa had succeeded? If she'd managed to turn me against you permanently?" I thought about his question seriously before answering. "Honestly, I think I would have spent the rest of my life trying to protect you from a distance. I would have found ways to make sure you were safe and taken care of, even if you never knew I was doing it. But you would have been miserable. Probably. But being miserable would have been a small price to pay for knowing that you were okay." Drake was quiet for a few minutes, looking out the airplane window at the lights of cities passing below us. "That's the difference between real love and manipulation, isn't it?" he said finally. "What do you mean?" Real love wants what's best for the other person, even when it's painful for you. Manipulation wants what's best for you, even when it's harmful to the other person. That's exactly right. Vanessa convinced me that your love was manipulation because she couldn't understand the difference between the two. She thought that because she used love as a weapon, everyone else did too. People tend to assume that others think the way they do. I agreed. But you never stopped loving me, even when I was treating you terribly, and you never tried to force me to come back to you. You just waited and protected me from a distance. That's what fathers do. No, Drake said, shaking his head. That's what good fathers do. That's what real love does. As our plane began its descent into Cleveland, I thought about all the families we'd been able to help over the past 6 months. The Hendersons in Texas, whose son had been isolated from them by a con artist posing as a life coach. The Williams family in Georgia, whose daughter had been convinced by a fraudulent financial advisor that her parents were trying to sabotage her independence. The elderly couple in Minnesota, whose adult children had been turned against them by a caregiver who was systematically stealing their life savings. Each case was different, but the pattern was always the same. Criminals who understood that the strongest people become vulnerable when they're isolated from their support systems, and the solution was always the same too. Patient, persistent love that refuses to give up, even when it seems hopeless. But there was one case that was still ongoing, and it was the one that kept me up at night. Remember Detective Castellanos? The one who'd called me that first night to tell me about Vanessa's crimes? Well, it turned out that his own family had been targeted by a similar con 3 years earlier. His daughter had been convinced by her boyfriend, a man who was running an investment scam, that her father was a corrupt cop who couldn't be trusted. The relationship between Ray and his daughter had been severed completely. She'd moved across the country with the boyfriend and refused all contact with her family. By the time the scam was exposed and the boyfriend was arrested, Ray's daughter was so ashamed of having been fooled that she couldn't bring herself to reach out to her father. I know she wants to come home, Ray told me during one of our regular check-ins. My ex-wife stays in touch with her, and she says Sarah asks about me all the time. But she's convinced that I must hate her for choosing a criminal over me. Have you tried reaching out to her directly? I've tried everything. Letters, emails, phone calls, even showing up at her apartment. She won't see me. She won't talk to me. I think the shame is just too overwhelming for her. This was the kind of case that our traditional approaches couldn't solve. It wasn't a matter of exposing an ongoing con or protecting someone from a current threat. It was about healing the psychological damage that had already been done. That's when I had an idea. Ray, I said, what if we approached this differently? What if instead of trying to convince Sarah to forgive herself, we gave her a way to help other people who were going through what she went through? What do you mean? I mean, what if we offered her a job? What if we asked her to help us counsel other victims who are dealing with shame and embarrassment about having been conned? Ray was skeptical at first, but the more we talked about it, the more it made sense. Sarah's experience as a victim, combined with her training as a social worker, would make her uniquely qualified to help other families heal from fraud-related trauma. More importantly, giving her a way to turn her painful experience into something helpful for others might allow her to forgive herself for having been victimized in the first place. We crafted a careful approach. Rather than Ray reaching out directly, I sent Sarah a letter explaining our victim advocacy work and asking if she'd be interested in consulting with us on some cases involving family estrangement. The letter was deliberately vague about the connection to her father, but it included enough details about our methods and success stories to make it clear that we understood the specific kind of manipulation she'd experienced. To our amazement, she responded within a week. Mr. Kowalski, she wrote, I received your letter about victim advocacy work, and I'm very interested in learning more. I have personal experience with the kind of family manipulation you describe, and I think I could contribute to your efforts to help other families heal from these experiences. She agreed to meet with us at our office in Cleveland. Ray was nervous beyond belief. He hadn't seen his daughter in over 3 years, and he wasn't sure how she'd react to discovering that he was part of our team. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in late summer. Drake and I had planned the introduction carefully. I would meet with Sarah first to explain our work and assess her qualifications. Then, once she was comfortable and engaged with the mission, Drake would bring Ray into the meeting. Sarah arrived exactly on time, a tall, serious young woman with her father's eyes and her mother's determined expression. She was professionally dressed and clearly nervous, but there was an intensity about her that suggested she was hungry for a chance to make a difference. "Ms. Castellanos," I said, shaking her hand, "thank you for coming. I'm Ted Kowalski." "Thank you for reaching out to me, Mr. Kowalski. Your letter described work that I've been hoping someone would be doing." We spent the first hour discussing her background in social work, her understanding of manipulation tactics, and her thoughts on family trauma recovery. She was impressive, articulate, insightful, and clearly passionate about helping people who'd been victimized by psychological manipulation. "The hardest part for victims," she said at one point, "isn't the financial loss. It's the shame. The feeling that they should have known better, that they were stupid or weak for falling for the con. And when the con involves family manipulation, there's an additional layer of guilt about having hurt people who love them." "You sound like you have some personal experience with this," I said gently. For the first time since she'd arrived, Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. "I do. I was involved with someone who turned me against my family. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd already done so much damage to those relationships that I wasn't sure they could ever be repaired." "And how did you handle that realization?" "Honestly, I didn't handle it well. I was so ashamed of what I'd done, so embarrassed about having been fooled, that I just ran away from the whole situation. I moved across the country and tried to pretend that part of my life had never happened." "But you can't really run away from family, can you?" "No," she said softly. "You can't. No matter how far you go or how much time passes, you still love them, and you still know that they love you. But the shame makes it feel impossible to bridge the gap." That's when I signaled to Drake, who stepped out of the office and returned with Ray. Sarah's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The moment she saw her father, she burst into tears and jumped up from her chair. Dad, what are you doing here?" Ray was crying too as he crossed the room to embrace his daughter. "I'm here because I love you," he said simply. "I'm here because I never stopped loving you, not for one single day. But Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so ashamed of what I did. I chose him over you. I believed his lies instead of trusting you. I said terrible things to you. Sarah, honey, you don't need to apologize. You were manipulated by someone whose job it was to manipulate people. You were a victim. But I hurt you. I know I hurt you." Ray held his daughter at arm's length, looking directly into her eyes. "Do you know what hurt me the most? It wasn't the things you said or the fact that you believed his lies about me. What hurt me the most was knowing that you were being victimized and not being able to protect you. You tried to warn me. You told me he was bad news. And when you didn't listen, do you know what I did? You gave up on me. I never gave up on you. I spent 3 years working with people like Mr. Kowalski, learning how to help families recover from this kind of manipulation. I spent 3 years getting ready for the day when you'd be ready to come home." Sarah looked from her father to me, beginning to understand what had just happened. "This whole job interview, this was all a setup to bring us back together." "Not a setup," I said. "An opportunity. We really do need someone with your qualifications and experience. But yes, we also hope that working together on this mission would give you and your father a chance to heal your relationship. The same way you and your son healed yours." I looked at Drake, who was watching the reunion with tears in his eyes. "Exactly the same way." What happened next surprised all of us. Instead of taking time to think about the job offer or asking for details about salary and benefits, Sarah immediately accepted the position. "When do I start?" she asked. "You already have. Ray said, smiling through his tears. That was 6 months ago. Since then, Sarah has become one of our most effective advocates, precisely because she understands both sides of the manipulation dynamic. She knows what it feels like to be isolated from family, and she knows what it takes to rebuild those relationships once the truth comes out. But more importantly, she and Ray have rebuilt their father-daughter relationship into something stronger than it ever was before. They work together now, helping other families navigate the same healing process they went through. Just last week, we got a letter from a family in Oregon whose son had been turned against them by a cult-like group. The letter was addressed specifically to Sarah. "Dear Ms. Castellanos," it read, "we heard about your story from another family you helped, and we're hoping you can give us some guidance. Our son joined a group that convinced him we were toxic influences in his life. He hasn't spoken to us in 2 years, and we're not sure how to approach him without pushing him further away." Sarah called the family that same day and spent 3 hours on the phone with them, sharing her own story and helping them develop a strategy for reconnecting with their son. "The key," she told them, "is to remember that love is patient. Real love doesn't force itself on people or demand immediate forgiveness. Real love just waits and keeps the door open and never gives up hope." After she hung up the phone, Sarah turned to me with a smile. "You know what's funny? 3 years ago, I thought my experience with manipulation and family estrangement was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Now I realize it was actually preparation for the most important work I'll ever do." "How so?" "Because now I can help other people understand that shame doesn't have to be permanent, that families can heal from this kind of damage, that love really is stronger than manipulation." She paused, looking out the window at the snow that was beginning to fall. "I spent 3 years thinking my father must hate me for what I'd done. But he spent those same 3 years getting ready to help me heal. While I was running away from our relationship, he was preparing to save it." "That's what real fathers do," I said. "Yeah," she said softly. "That's what real fathers do." As I write this story, it's been exactly 2 years since that Christmas dinner when I handed Vanessa Hayes the folder that contained evidence of all her crimes. 2 years since my son stood up in front of our family and friends and rejected me as his father, only to discover that the woman who'd manipulated him into doing so was nothing more than a professional criminal. Vanessa is now serving a 12-year federal sentence. Her appeals have all been denied, and the comprehensive documentation we created has been used to prosecute similar cases in 17 states. The victim advocacy protocols we developed are now being used by law enforcement agencies across the country. But those aren't the victories I'm most proud of. The victory I'm most proud of is the fact that Drake and I have breakfast together every Sunday morning. The victory I'm most proud of is that he calls me for advice about everything from business decisions to relationship troubles. The victory I'm most proud of is that when people ask him about his father, he talks about how I taught him that real love never gives up, even when things seem hopeless. Drake is dating someone new now, a woman named Amanda who's a teacher at the local elementary school. She's kind, intelligent, and completely supportive of his relationship with me. The first time she came to Sunday breakfast, she brought homemade cinnamon rolls and asked if I had any embarrassing baby pictures of Drake she could see. "Dad," Drake said, laughing, "please don't show her the one where I'm 3 years old and covered in chocolate cake." "Too late," I said, already pulling out the photo albums. That's when Amanda looked at me with genuine curiosity. "Mr. Kowalski, Drake told me about what you went through with his ex-wife. How did you keep believing that your relationship could be repaired when things look so hopeless?" I thought about her question for a moment before answering. "Amanda, do you have children?" "Not yet, but I hope to someday." "When you do, you'll understand something that's impossible to explain to someone who's never been a parent. The love you feel for your child isn't conditional on their behavior or their choices. It's not something you can turn off or give up on, it just is." I looked at Drake, who was listening intently. Even when Drake was treating me like I was the enemy, even when he wouldn't take my calls or return my messages, I never stopped being his father, and being his father meant protecting him even when he didn't want my protection. Amanda nodded thoughtfully. That must have been incredibly painful. It was. But you know what would have been more painful? Giving up on him. Walking away and pretending that our relationship didn't matter. That would have been the real tragedy. Drake reached over and squeezed my hand. Dad, I still can't believe you spent all that time and money building a case against Vanessa while I wasn't even speaking to you. Son, that's what insurance is. You hope you'll never need it, but you make sure it's there just in case. I was building an insurance policy against the day when you'd be ready to see the truth about what had happened to us. But what if I'd never been ready? What if I'd never figured out what she really was? I smiled. Then I would have kept building the case until I found a way to make you ready. I would have spent the rest of my life if necessary. Even if it meant never having a relationship with me again? Drake, I'd rather spend my life loving you from a distance than stop loving you at all. That's not even a choice for me, it's just who I am. Amanda was quiet for a moment, absorbing what she'd just heard. That's beautiful, she said finally. That's the kind of love I hope to give my children someday. You will, I assured her, because that's what real parents do. We love our children no matter what, and we never give up on them, even when they give up on themselves. But the story of our family healing wasn't the only thing that had grown from that Christmas dinner confrontation. The ripple effects continued to spread in ways we never could have anticipated. Remember the Yamamoto family, the one that had lost their restaurant to Vanessa's franchise scam? Well, with the restitution money they recovered through our victim advocacy work, they were able to start over. They opened a new restaurant in San Francisco, and it's been so successful that they're planning to open a second location. But here's the remarkable part. They hired Frank Pedersen, the elderly man from Florida, who'd also been one of Vanessa's victims, as their financial advisor. Frank had been a successful accountant before he retired, and his experience with fraud made him uniquely qualified to help other small business owners protect themselves from similar scams. It's like a support group, Mrs. Yamamoto told me during one of our follow-up calls. But instead of just talking about what happened to us, we're helping each other build something better. Janet Morrison, the woman from Phoenix whose husband had committed suicide after Vanessa's con, had used her experience to become a grief counselor, specializing in trauma related to financial fraud. She'd started a support group for families who'd lost loved ones to suicide after being victimized by cons, and it had grown into a national network. Ted, she told me during one of our regular check-ins, I want you to know that what you did, bringing all of us together, showing us that we weren't alone, it saved my life. After my husband died, I was so angry and isolated that I was considering ending my own life. But meeting the other families, seeing that we could fight back and help each other heal, it gave me a reason to keep going. Even Detective Castellanos had been impacted by the case in ways that went beyond his reunion with his daughter. He'd been promoted to head a new task force focused specifically on family manipulation cons, and the protocols we'd developed together were being implemented by police departments across the Midwest. The thing is, Ted, he told me over coffee one afternoon, before this case, we treated these crimes like they were just financial fraud. We'd focus on the money that was stolen and try to get convictions based on the financial evidence. But it's not just about money, is it? Not at all. The financial theft is just the surface level. The real crime is the psychological manipulation, the way these criminals destroy families and turn people against each other. That's what causes the lasting damage. And now you're training other officers to recognize that? Exactly. We're teaching them to look for the family isolation patterns, to understand how these cons work psychologically, and to connect victims with resources like your advocacy services that can help rebuild the relationships that were damaged. But perhaps the most unexpected development came 6 months after Sarah joined our team. We received a call from a federal prosecutor in New York who was working on what he described as the biggest family manipulation case in U.S. history. Mr. Kowalski, he said, We have a situation involving a group that's been running coordinated cons targeting wealthy families across the country. They specialize in isolating adult children from their parents, and then systematically draining the children's inheritance and trust fund access. How many families are we talking about? Over 200 across 15 states. The total amount stolen is estimated at over $50 million. I was stunned. And you want our help with victim advocacy? We want more than that. We want you to lead the entire victim coordination effort. Based on what you accomplished in the Hayes case, you're the only person in the country with the experience and expertise to handle something of this magnitude. The case, which became known as Operation Family Trust, took 8 months to investigate and prosecute. Drake, Sarah, Ray, and I worked with a team of federal agents and prosecutors to coordinate testimony from over 400 victims and their family members. The psychological manipulation in this case was even more sophisticated than what Vanessa had done to our family. The criminal organization had teams of specialists. Some focused on identifying wealthy targets. Others specialized in creating false romantic relationships to gain access to the families. And still others were experts in psychological manipulation techniques designed to turn children against their parents. But what made the case truly heartbreaking was the scope of the family destruction they'd caused. We interviewed parents who hadn't spoken to their children in over 5 years. We met siblings who'd been turned against each other so completely that they'd filed lawsuits against one another. We worked with grandparents who'd been cut off from their grandchildren entirely. The healing process for these families was long and complex, but it was also incredibly rewarding. We developed new techniques for family reconciliation, created support groups for parents who'd been isolated from their children, and established protocols for helping adult children overcome the shame and embarrassment of having been manipulated. One case that particularly moved me involved the Peterson family from Connecticut. The parents, David and Margaret Peterson, had been successful real estate developers who'd built a small empire of properties across New England. Their son Kevin was their only child and heir to the family business. Kevin had been targeted by a woman named Lisa Chen, who'd presented herself as a successful entrepreneur looking for real estate investment opportunities. Over the course of 2 years, Lisa had systematically convinced Kevin that his parents were controlling, manipulative people who were trying to keep him from reaching his full potential. The thing is, Margaret Peterson told me during our first meeting, Kevin was always such a level-headed boy. He was close to his father and me. He loved working in the family business. He had a good relationship with his girlfriend. And then Lisa came along, and within 6 months everything changed. What were the first signs that something was wrong? I asked. Kevin started questioning everything we did. If David offered him advice about a business decision, Kevin would interpret it as us not trusting his judgment. If I called to invite them to dinner, he'd say we were being intrusive and not respecting his independence. David Peterson nodded grimly. It was like watching our son turn into a completely different person. He started using language that didn't sound like him, calling us toxic and codependent, and saying we needed to respect his boundaries. And Lisa was encouraging this interpretation of your relationship? More than encouraging it, Margaret said. She was orchestrating it. We found out later that she had a whole system. She'd take innocent conversations Kevin had with us and then spend hours helping him analyze what we'd really meant. She'd twist everything we said into evidence of manipulation or control. The most devastating part of the Peterson case was that Kevin had eventually signed over his entire inheritance to Lisa, believing that this would prove to his parents that he was an independent adult who didn't need their financial support. He thought he was making a statement about his maturity, David said, his voice breaking. He thought he was showing us that he could succeed without relying on family money. But what he was actually doing was handing over everything our family had built to a criminal who was planning to disappear the moment she had access to it. By the time Kevin realized what had happened, Lisa had vanished with over $3 million in cash and property assets. She'd also left behind a mountain of debt that Kevin was legally responsible for, effectively bankrupting him overnight. The financial loss was devastating, Margaret said, but it wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Kevin was so ashamed of what he'd done that he couldn't face us. He'd lost our life savings and destroyed our business, and he was convinced we must hate him for it. How long has it been since you've spoken to him? I asked. 18 months, David replied. He moved to California and won't return our calls or emails. The few times we've tried to visit him, he's refused to see us. This was exactly the kind of case that our new techniques were designed to address. Kevin wasn't just dealing with financial devastation. He was drowning in shame, guilt, and self-recrimination. Traditional approaches to family reconciliation wouldn't work because the psychological barriers were too high. So we tried something different. Instead of having David and Margaret reach out to Kevin directly, we had other victims from similar cases contact him. People who'd been through the exact same experience, who'd been manipulated into turning against their families, and then lost everything to the criminals who'd exploited them. The first person we connected Kevin with was Michael Torres, a man from Texas, whose story was almost identical to Kevin's. Michael had been isolated from his family by a con artist who'd convinced him to invest his entire trust fund in a fraudulent business venture. The shame was the worst part, Michael told Kevin during their first phone conversation. I kept thinking, how could I have been so stupid? How could I have fallen for such an obvious con? But what I didn't understand at the time was that I wasn't stupid. I was targeted by professionals who'd spent years perfecting their manipulation techniques. But I hurt my parents so badly, Kevin replied. I said terrible things to them. I accused them of trying to control me when they were actually trying to protect me. Kevin, let me ask you something. When you said those things to your parents, did you believe them at the time? Yes, absolutely. I was convinced they were trying to manipulate me. And where did that conviction come from? Kevin was quiet for a moment. From Lisa. She was the one who helped me understand what my parents were really doing. So you weren't lying to your parents or trying to hurt them. You were expressing what you genuinely believed to be true, based on information that someone else had given you. I guess that's right. Kevin, if someone convinced you that the sky was green, and you went around telling people the sky was green, would that make you a liar? Or would it make you someone who'd been given false information? Someone who'd been given false information. Exactly. And that's what happened with your parents. You weren't trying to hurt them. You were operating on false information that Lisa had systematically fed to you. Over the course of several weeks, Michael and other victims worked with Kevin to help him understand that he wasn't a villain in this story. He was a victim. They helped him see that his parents weren't angry with him for being conned. They were heartbroken that he was suffering and isolated. The breakthrough came when Kevin finally agreed to let us arrange a phone call between him and his parents. Kevin? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper when she heard her son on the line. Hi, Mom. Both of them were crying within seconds. Kevin, honey, we love you so much. We've missed you so much. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did. I lost everything. I ruined our business. I destroyed everything you and Dad worked for. Kevin, David said, joining the conversation. You didn't destroy anything that can't be rebuilt. The only thing we care about is having you back in our lives. But Dad, I gave away millions of dollars to a criminal. I was so stupid. Son, you weren't stupid. You were victimized. There's a difference. How can you forgive me? Kevin, Margaret said gently. There's nothing to forgive. You were manipulated by someone who was very good at manipulation. If anyone should be asking for forgiveness, it's us. What? Why? Because we should have recognized what was happening sooner, David said. We should have found a way to protect you before it got to this point. That phone call lasted for 4 hours. By the end of it, Kevin had agreed to come home for a visit. The reunion at the airport was one of the most emotional things I've ever witnessed. David and Margaret Peterson hadn't seen their son in over a year and a half, and when Kevin walked out of the jetway, all three of them collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing. I thought I'd lost you forever, Margaret whispered to her son. You never lost me, Mom. I was just lost. But I'm home now. Are you really home? David asked. Or are you just visiting? Kevin smiled through his tears. I'm home, Dad. If you'll have me, I'm home for good. The Peterson family's story became one of our most successful case studies in family reconciliation after fraud-related manipulation. Kevin moved back to Connecticut, and he and his parents spent the next year rebuilding both their relationship and their business. But more importantly, Kevin became one of our most effective victim advocates. Like Sarah Castellanos, he had the unique perspective of someone who'd been on both sides of the manipulation dynamic. He understood what it felt like to be turned against his family, and he understood the process of rebuilding those relationships afterward. The thing people don't realize, Kevin told me during one of our training sessions, is that when you're being manipulated, you don't feel like a victim. You feel empowered. You feel like you're finally seeing the truth about your relationships and making mature, independent decisions. So, how do you help someone who's currently in that mindset? You don't try to convince them they're wrong. You just plant seeds of doubt and then wait for them to start questioning things on their own. And most importantly, you make sure they know that when they're ready to come home, there will still be a home waiting for them. As I reflect on all of these stories, my own family's healing, the victims we've helped, the criminals we've stopped, the relationships we've rebuilt, I'm struck by a simple truth that Vanessa Hayes never understood. Love is not a weakness that can be exploited. Love is not a tool that can be used to control people. Love is not something that can be destroyed by lies or manipulation. Real love, the kind of love that exists between parents and children, the kind of love that binds families together, is the most powerful force in the world precisely because it can't be faked, can't be manipulated, and can't be destroyed. Vanessa thought she could use Drake's love for me as a weapon against both of us. What she didn't understand is that real love doesn't work that way. Real love doesn't seek to control or possess. Real love seeks to protect and nurture, even when it's painful to do so. The folder I handed to Vanessa that Christmas night, the one that contained all the evidence of her crimes and the documentation of her victims, wasn't really a gift for her. It was a gift for every family she might have destroyed in the future. It was my way of saying that love will always find a way to protect the people it cares about. And the reaction she had when she opened that folder, the screaming, the rage, the complete loss of composure, that wasn't just anger at being caught. That was the reaction of someone who finally understood that she had created her own worst enemy. She had taken a father's love for his son and tried to turn it into a weapon. Instead, she had forged that love into armor that would protect countless other families from experiencing what we had experienced. Today, 3 years after that Christmas dinner, Drake and I work side by side every day. We've helped over 300 families recover from fraud-related manipulation. We've assisted law enforcement agencies in 17 states with victim advocacy protocols. We've trained thousands of counselors, social workers, and police officers to recognize and address family manipulation tactics. But most importantly, we've proven that love really is stronger than manipulation. We've shown that families can heal from even the most devastating psychological damage. We've demonstrated that criminals who think they can destroy the bonds between parents and children are fighting a battle they can never win. Because at the end of the day, Vanessa Hayes, Veronica Hayes, whatever her real name is, made one crucial mistake in her strategy. She assumed that because she didn't understand what real love looked like, nobody else did either. She assumed that because she used love as a weapon, everyone else would too. She assumed that because she was willing to sacrifice anything for personal gain, parents would eventually give up on their children if the manipulation went on long enough. She was wrong on all counts. And now she's spending the next 12 years in federal prison, thinking about just how wrong she was. The last time I saw Vanessa was at her sentencing hearing. As the judge was reading her sentence, 12 years for fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and witness intimidation, she turned around and looked directly at me. For a moment, I thought she might try to say something, an apology maybe, or one final attempt at manipulation. Instead, she just stared at me with what looked like genuine confusion, as if she still couldn't understand how her perfect plan had backfired so completely. I smiled at her and mouthed 2 words. Thank you. Because in the end, that's what she deserved to hear. By trying to destroy my family, she had made us stronger than we'd ever been. By attempting to turn my love for my son into a weapon, she had turned it into a shield that would protect hundreds of other families. She had created something beautiful without meaning to, and I wanted her to know that. As the bailiff led her away in shackles, Vanessa looked back one more time. This time there was no confusion in her eyes. There was recognition. She finally understood what she had done, and more importantly, what she had failed to do. She had failed to destroy the love between a father and his son, and that failure had become the foundation for something much bigger than revenge. It had become the foundation for healing, protection, and hope for families all across the country. Drake and I walked out of the courthouse that day with our arms around each other's shoulders, the same way we used to walk when he was a little boy, and we'd spend Saturday afternoons fishing at the lake. "Dad," he said as we reached the car, "do you think she finally gets it now?" "Gets what?" "That love always wins. That you can try to manipulate it, twist it, use it against people, but in the end, real love always finds a way to protect the people it cares about." I thought about his question as I started the car. You know what, son? I don't think Vanessa will ever truly understand that. I don't think she's capable of understanding it. Why not? Because understanding real love requires having experienced it, and I don't think she ever has. That's sad. Yes, it is. But that's also why what we do is so important. We're helping people who do understand love, people who've temporarily lost their way, find their way back to the families who never stopped loving them. As we drove home through the streets of Cleveland, I thought about all the families we'd helped reunite, all the criminals we'd stopped, all the relationships we'd healed. But mostly, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Drake just that morning over our Sunday breakfast. "Dad," he'd said, "I have something to tell you." "What's that?" "Amanda and I are engaged." I'd nearly choked on my coffee. "Engaged? When did this happen?" "Last night. I proposed at the restaurant where we had our first date." "Drake, that's wonderful. Congratulations." "Thanks, Dad, but there's something I need to ask you." "Anything." "I want you to be my best man." I'd stared at him for a moment, not sure I'd heard correctly. "Your best man? Don't you want one of your friends?" "Dad, you're my best friend. You're the person who never gave up on me when I gave up on myself. You're the person who protected me when I didn't want protection. You're the person who taught me what real love looks like." He'd paused, getting emotional. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather have standing beside me when I make vows to love someone for the rest of my life." Now, driving home from Vanessa's sentencing, I smiled thinking about that conversation. In 6 months, I'd be standing next to my son at the altar, watching him marry a woman who loved and respected him the way he deserved to be loved. I'd be there not as someone who'd had to fight to earn back a place in his life, but as someone who'd never really lost that place to begin with. Because that's what real love does. It endures, it protects, it waits, it hopes, it never gives up, and it always wins in the end. That Christmas dinner 3 years ago, when my son stood up and announced that I was no longer his father, I thought my world was ending. I had no idea it was actually just beginning. So there you have it, folks. That's the story of how my Christmas dinner from hell turned into the foundation for the most meaningful work of my life. If you've made it this far, I want you to do me a favor. Look in the comments below and tell me, have you ever had someone try to manipulate your relationships with the people you love? How did you handle it? What advice would you give to someone going through something similar? And if you know someone who's been cut off from their family by a manipulative partner or friend, please share this story with them. Let them know that shame doesn't have to be permanent, that families can heal from this kind of damage, and that love really is stronger than manipulation. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because next week, I'm going to tell you about the letter I received from Vanessa just last month. Yes, she's still in prison, and yes, She's still trying to manipulate people from behind bars. But the letter she sent me contained something I never expected to see from her. Something that might actually change everything. Until next time, remember, real love never gives up, never stops fighting, and never stops protecting the people it cares about. Even when they don't want that protection. Especially when they don't want that protection. Thanks for listening to my story, and I'll see you in the next video.